This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. This is officially starting now after a couple of false starts, but here we are. We have a very distinguished and knowledgeable panel with us today to discuss food sovereignty. The name of the panel is A Recipe for Food Sovereignty. And just before we start, I just need to introduce the poll that we have, which is sponsored by Yara. And you can answer this poll by logging into Swapcard. So it should be, I think you have to download the app, and it should be pretty easy to join it. Use a hashtag, Politico Agri-Food. And the question that the poll is asking is, how can the EU reduce its dependencies in the agri-food value chain and achieve sovereignty? So yeah, do answer the poll, do tweet using the same hashtag Politico Agri-Food. Now I'll give a proper introduction. I gave like a small introduction to the speakers before, but now I'll give a full introduction. So starting from the furthest left, David Laborde, very nice to have you here, Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI. I think, are you based in Washington, or it's based in Washington, but you work here?
Headquartered in Washington, and I'm based in Washington.
Okay, so wow, great that you've made the transatlantic journey. Nicolas Broutin, President of Yara France. Thank you for being here. On my direct left, Michael Scannell, Deputy Director General of the Directorate General for Agriculture in the European Commission, and then a late change of participants. I'm not sure if Martin Hlavaček is with us online right now, or he could join us in a few minutes. Anyway, we're expecting Czech MEP Martin Hlavaček to be joining us, and it should be interesting as well, given that it's the Czech presidency of the EU at the moment as well, to have him with us. So thank you for stepping in, if you are indeed there. Just to set this, I think I don't need to set the scene too much, because I think our three interviewees beforehand have done that, very well. We've got a situation where food prices are slightly recovering. It's not as bad as it was at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, but it's certainly worse than this stage last year. And we also have a situation where everyone. This is almost the year of agricultural markets. Everyone's watching what's going up and down. Even lay people like myself are getting used to tracking commodity prices, because it's all having such a big impact on food yields and on food security and food sovereignty. So maybe Michael, you could just kick us off. You've been tracking this since the very beginning. I think the war in Ukraine really has exposed how dependent European agriculture, EU agriculture, is on certain commodities from outside, whether it's corn from Ukraine, whether it's fertilizers from Russia. But is that right, that this has shown that actually Europe isn't actually that sovereign when it comes to certain commodities?
Well, I think, first and foremost, we have to recognize our strengths. We have a very productive and efficient agri-food production system. And if you look at all the major commodities, whether it's, for example, wheat, dairy products, beef, pig meat, poultry, etc., we're more than self-sufficient. We're actually major exporters. But you also have to recognize where you're vulnerable. And we're on record, we're vulnerable in certain key areas, as, for example, our reliance on imported fertilizers, which reflects a reality. Physically, geographically, we don't have the capacity in Europe to produce phosphates, potash. We don't have the supplies of natural gas for nitrate-based fertilizers, etc. And similarly, we're vulnerable in relation to imports of animal feed. But having recognized these vulnerabilities, the challenge is, how do you address them? And there, the Commission is clear. We've gone on record. We had our communication in March earlier this year, in the immediate aftermath of the war, the outbreak of war in Ukraine, highlighting the challenges that confront us both at European level, in Ukraine itself, and globally, because all these, there's interplays between all three. And we have strategies on basically strengthening our resilience.
Yeah.
We have a lot of experience in this area, obviously. You know, all major agri-food production systems are confronted with challenges. It might be an animal disease, it might be a trade dispute, it might be a climatic event. In this case, it's a war in Ukraine, which has disrupted international markets.
Sure, and we'll get on to how the EU is really, trying to ramp up its food sovereignty. But first, I also wanted to come early on to David and ask you to define food sovereignty, because from what I've written about it, I mean, this term it's a very French term. It's just a food sovereignty, la souveraineté alimentaire. I mean, it's even been added to the title of the French minister who we had sitting where you're sitting before. And I think the history of the term is interesting as well. It's now being used as a sort of byword, as sort of synonym for food security, which is really what we mean when we're talking about fertilizer, corn coming into the EU. But also, it had its roots in the sort of small-scale farmers movement via Campesina. I mean, they invented the term food sovereignty. So can you tell us a bit about what do you mean when you talk about food sovereignty?
Personally, I try to avoid to talk about food sovereignty. I'm always worried when we start to talk about sovereignty, about livelihood of people. No, what we are really interested in, me personally, is food security. And food security is having this capacity to have access to food, to have the purchasing power for food. So there is a lot issue related to poverty, actually to income distribution. My grandmother was telling me, when the rich start to be hungry, the poor are already dead. So we should never forget that there is a strong economic aspect of it. And of course, the quality of the food also matter. And when we talk about food security, and that's the term used in the UN institution, there is 4 pillars, and that's what we all agreed on a general basis. When you start to go beyond that, you had, during many years, the notion of self-sufficiency. We are safer if we just eat what we produce. But now that's a very sensitive topic, because first, actually, it's not true, and I can explain why. But also, when you are in France, for instance, a lot of French farmers like to export, okay? So if now your neighbors say, oh no, but I want to be self-sufficient, you don't export anymore. So then you start to find this mixed concept, food sovereignty. So we are in control, and I will say clearly, Europe has no problem of food sovereignty. Europe makes the rules about the food that Europeans eat, the rules about how farmers grow plants, and actually European policy shape largely many places around the world. So it's not like if we are taker of the policies of others. Europe is really in control of its destiny, and Europe produces actually more calories that it needs to feed its population. Then it decides to do different things. Based on cultural aspect, but we'll use also part of our arable land to produce biofuel, for instance. So it's a choice, driven by policy. But Europe doesn't have a problem of food sovereignty. We have a much bigger issue in terms of energy sovereignty. And of course, because all these systems are interlinked, but the main issue we have right now with this crisis is more, the question of natural gas that will impact fertilizer, but actually impact also the whole food system. I think we should not simplify the story. So that will be my take on food sovereignty before going back.
That's good. You ended exactly how I wanted you to end, because you talked about energy, so we can bring in Nicolas. We are facing an energy crisis in Europe. I mean, Yara, I think it's Europe's major nitrogen fertilizer producer, Norwegian, based in Norway. I mean, can you give us the sort of overview of how, how many factories have closed down, or what % of production is closing because of the high cost of nitrogen gas at the moment, and gas? Yeah.
Food is gas.
Okay.
And I think this is what everyone is kind of discovering in the current situation. We need gas because gas is hydrogen. As Yara in Europe, we produce between 20 and 25% of European hydrogen through gas. So this gas is really needed to produce ammonia, which is the entry point of the mineral fertilizers, especially containing nitrogen. Nitrogen being one of the key nutrients for the plants. So situation today indeed is extremely complicated, not only due to the high prices, but due to volatility. It's extremely difficult for industrial players like us to deal with such a volatile situation. So we stated end of August that 65% of our ammonia production is indeed reduced in Europe. We have solutions in the short term, in the long term, we can deal with this, but gas is fully linked with food, and we estimate that nearly half of the world's population is having food thanks to ammonia production.
Okay.
That's half of the world's population.
So do you think that, I mean, Michael, you hosted like a sort of a meeting of this expert group last week in the Commission, where the question of how fertilizer prices are going to impact food production. I mean, I want to ask Nicola first, and then ask you, Michael. But do you think there is a risk? I mean, I don't want to be sensationalist or worry people, because at the moment there is no food security problem in Europe. There is food on the shelves, everything's fine. But do you think that if this high energy prices continue and Yara can't produce as much fertilizer in the next 1, 2, 3 years, would that start having an impact on food production and the amount of food actually being produced?
Today, Europe is clearly replacing its own local fertilizer production, which is basically a nitrate production, by imported urea, which is actually a more emissive product than nitrates. So this is what happens today, and this is what will happen if the situation remains unchanged. So we have solutions, because by using the right nitrogen form, by applying correctly, and farmers, they have tools today to increase the nutrient efficiency, which is key. We have short-term solutions. A farmer today, by using the right form and using it properly, can reduce by 20% nitrogen use, for example. Using nitrates is increasing its revenue by 7% and decreasing emissions by 20%. So we have in Europe the solutions. This is what we can do short term by using the right form, by supporting this industry, because we need it in the long term for food security. But then we have solutions as well to replace hydrogen, because electrolysis is a solution. We have technologies. We can replace gas by water. This is available technology, but it needs huge capex in the long run. So we need that support, I think, to keep a Europe industry on its feet.
And what were those different parts of the food sector telling you? I mean, what's the, from what I was hearing, it was quite a grim picture. People are worried, the poultry sector, the cereals sector, whoever it is, they're worried that, if there are shortages, shortages of gas, if there is rationing imposed by governments across Europe, then, that could end up impacting the food sector. Is the EU, ready for that? Is the EU ready to step in and give advice to different countries saying, don't let any of your, if you're cutting electricity for 3 hours a day, don't let it affect the food sector? Is that part of your planning?
Yes, but I think you have to look at the broader picture. The Commission has already worked intensively with the Member States on our so-called winter preparedness plan, because all sectors of the economy are exposed. Agriculture has its own particular issues, and obviously in that context, Member States have been requested to essentially give priority to those sectors which are most vulnerable to the current energy crisis. In that context, obviously, it's extremely important to give priority to the agro-food industry, because basically citizens have to have available to them safe, high-quality, affordable food. And anything that would disrupt that, obviously, is politically, socially, economically very dangerous. So Member States are very aware of it. We discussed this at length with Member States and key stakeholders last Friday in our expert group on food security. And basically the message has to go through again and again that we've got to strengthen our resilience, short-term, medium-term, long-term. And under each and every one of those headings, obviously, measures are underway. Some, like, for example, developing green, blue hydrogen, etc., reducing our reliance on fossil fuels in general, our whole sustainability agenda. All roads lead eventually back to this issue of our over-reliance on fossil fuels and on imported fossil fuels from countries like Russia in particular. So basically, the message has to be repeated again and again. We really have to work very decisively, very urgently on reducing those dependencies.
And David, can I bring you in here for maybe an outsider's perspective or outside the EU bubble perspective on the Green Deal, because the situation and this year with so many catastrophes and crises happening has pulled parts of the bubble in two ways, but parts of the policy debate in two ways. Some say we should leave behind the sort of short-term goals of the Green Deal and just focus on producing more food. Others say, like Michael, that no, the Green Deal stays as the ultimate solution because it means reducing dependencies on these things which are actually driving the climate problem in many ways. So what do you think about what Michael just said in terms of that short-term, long-term approach?
Okay, so I think clearly the short-term crisis or the type of narrative we have around the short-term crisis should not weaken the long-term agenda. When I start to hear this morning that, we have a problem this year due to the Ukraine war, I'm jumping on my seat, okay? Because food price, so we have an hunger situation that deteriorated in the world since 2015. The food prices, the fertilizer prices were already increasing last year. For the first semester of this year, we have lost 1.5 million tons of wheat from Ukraine. Due to the drought in Canada and in the US, the world market has lost 9 million tons of wheat. So when you start to see the price of wheat, you understand that it's a climate shock that is really driving the story. On top, the war makes things much worse. But that's not the core driver here. The same thing due to La Niña event that we got now for 3 years in a row. Last year, we lost 31 million tons of soybean in South America. And of course, we got the drought in Europe. So really, I think starting to think that the main issue is climate. And all the policy we design should be about making sure that we, on one hand, have a mitigation effort, making the climate crisis, if still possible, less a crisis that will impact everyone in the world. But also starting to invest in adaptation with technology, both in terms of reducing the footprint of the input we use, but also making sure that we need less and less input per unit of output. That's key. Now, also, and I think it's very important when we talk about food sovereignty, is markets and world markets operate. Because, as I've said, we have lost wheat from Ukraine, we have lost wheat from Canada and the US, but Argentina has exported more, Australia has exported more, and so on, including France at the beginning of the year, we're exporting more. When one country disappears, another can play a role. If you are just within your own bunker and you have a drought, or you have a mad cow disease, and you lose 30%, 40% of your livestock, you are very happy to have other countries in the world where you can trade with. And that's what we want, a system that is interconnected, because a net is much more resistant than individual thread. So that will be the thing we should keep in that. So in this context, yes, having the European policy being about sustainable production for its own production, but also for, I would say, it's still important to not think Europe as a Garden of Eden that just produce for its own wealthy population, but also an aging population. Europe has some very strong comparative advantage in some agricultural product, and it still makes sense for the whole world that Europe exports some product, imports some product, and that's where technology, and we just have to be careful that a Green Deal doesn't destroy the potential that exists in Europe when they make sense from a sustainability point of view.
Okay, just got a note saying that Martin Hlavacek is able to join us now. Can you hear us, Martin?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can indeed. We'll come to you in a moment. I don't know whether you've had time to actually listen to any of the discussions, so I want to give you a bit of bedding in time. But that was interesting what you're saying. I mean, how does Yara view the Green Deal? Do you because obviously 50% of nutrient losses must be cut under the farm to fork strategy from fertilizers. I mean, so I mean, is Yara a fan of the Green Deal, or do you think that it should be delayed? Like other people have been saying, maybe pushed back a little bit because of all the crises and climate crises that we're facing at the moment.
You had an interesting discussion with Marc Fesneau on the topic, and I think we need to combine both. In our view, intensification is not wrong. because intensification can save some very useful hectares for biodiversity, for climate protection as well. So intensification is, according to us, the right path, but we need to intensify in a more in a greener way. So that's where, again, we have solutions in the long run which need support. I mentioned green hydrogen. We have blue hydrogen as well as maybe an intermediate solution. But we need to work on circular economy. We need to work on nutrient use efficiency. And we have huge margins to improve in that area. So looking at the Green Deal targets, our calculation is that if we would apply the nitrate European system for the farmers when it comes to fertilizers, we can match it. We can match it. I was mentioning 20% savings, both right form and right use. So again, we can have this intelligent intensification, according to us, matching both the need to produce and the need to protect the planet.
But for the time being, I mean, you said at the end of August, 65% of your production in Europe is down. Has that figure gone even higher now since then?
No, the situation isn't changed. Of course, we are monitoring closely every week because, again, not only the absolute price level is an issue, but volatility is the issue. We have assets that should normally run 24 hours, 365 days. So we are assessing the situation regularly. Right. And of course, the gas, as it had been mentioned as well here, is a war weapon, clearly, and that's what hurts today.
And I mean, we've been talking as well about, David, you were talking about the importance to look at how the world market functions and how there are, countries need to export, other countries need to import, and that should be normal. And that's what needed, because in case in case Brazil is hit by a hurricane or something one year, maybe Argentina steps up or something like that. But I mean, when it comes to just on fertilizers a little bit more now, I mean, yesterday we saw that the European Commissioner for Agriculture, Janusz Wojciechowski, was in Bali for the G20, and he was talking to the Canadians, and he was talking about fertilizers there. I mean, is the EU making big geopolitical strides now to make sure that more fertilizer is coming in? Because obviously, if Yara is down by 65%, then something needs to be done, right?
Well, yes, we've obviously acknowledged that we have an issue here. How do we access fertilizers, particularly with the forthcoming planting season in prospect? But solutions are being found. Taking Yara as an example, Yara doesn't only produce fertilizers here in Europe, it has global operations. So essentially, in the short term, one solution is to import more, which is why my commissioner is speaking to his Canadian counterpart, why we meet regularly with the Americans, etc., to ensure that we can find alternatives to what we've lost arising from our problems with gas supplies from Russia. But let's not lose sight of the medium and long term. Essentially, we will get over this short-term crisis. We're good at dealing with that kind of thing, but ultimately we can't afford to allow ourselves vulnerable to a situation where we're reliant on imports for key inputs like fertilizers. So we have to move and look towards alternatives. And there are lots of alternatives out there. And in this context, we have to focus in particular on innovation. Basically, we have to find non-mineral alternatives to our current fertilizer agri-food production systems. And the whole thrust of our reform CAP, the CAP strategic plans, the ECO schemes, our innovation policies, our policies on energy in general are directed at moving in that direction, not just for European agriculture, but European economy in general.
Okay, the CAP is actually the subject of our next panel, but I saw you, I shouldn't look at that screen, I should look at this screen. But Martin isn't on that screen. Oh, here he is, okay, great. So I saw you nodding along there when Michael was talking about, the difference, not the need not to lose track of our longer term goals in the EU. I mean, what would you say about that? Do you think that Europe is on a path to becoming more sovereign, more self-sufficient, maybe not totally self-sufficient, but a bit less dependent on other, parts of the world for its own food system?
We are not yet, and I will tell you why, because we have a lot of inconsistencies. Because it is for sure that we have nutrient deficiency and we have protein deficiency. Colleagues have spoken about that already. But then the point is it a problem or not? And it wouldn't be a big problem if we were living in a world of stable markets and stable multilateral system. But as you know, the multilateralism and the rules around them are under crisis, and that crisis is increasing. And the same stands for the volatility of the market. So in this context, we cannot afford to do as we did before. Of course, there is some potential we can help ourselves, but here, unfortunately, we are not consistent. We need to produce more with less. We need to overcome those deficiencies, but then these are new varieties. We are lagging behind in new genomic techniques. This is improved farm and soil management. It takes so long before we have even seen scripts or blueprints of a methodology for carbon farming and other stuff. It's in the pipeline. We have to develop alternative sources of protein. Today, imports of soya can be to big extent, and this is basis of our animal nutrition and entire animal production sector. It can be to big extent substituted by alternative protein that can be produced here. But again, we have legislation in place that is inhibiting it, despite the fact that in Green Deal and Farm to Fork, we are preaching differently for acceleration, but we are not consistent. And that's partly also on the Commission's shoulders, because if you talk to people in DG Center, they tell you, sorry, so we are here to protect health. We are not here to implement Green Deal. But then we have to be policy consistent. Okay. And having said that, I'm very happy we have this discussion. Unfortunately, it's triggered by crisis. But even on Yara, I'm very happy what I hear today. But Yara is also a victim of their own management of expectations in Brussels. They've been around here for months and months in every office, commissioners, MEPs everywhere, and the people they got a message from them. It's fine. We can have tomorrow hydrogen-based fertilizers. So we know this crisis is coming since April. Nobody acted the same way as on electricity. And now, hopefully, something is moving. But Yara forgot to tell those people, but this will not be tomorrow. Okay, this will be in 5, 10, 15 years from now. And in the meantime, we need solutions. So I fully echo what Michael has said. We have to find a cure for the current situation, but we also have to think long term. And then last point I want to mention, this is about enforcement. So if we are going into this direction, we have to also make sure that the world goes along with us. And that's not a simple issue. But, and why? People say perhaps it is another element how we introduce protectionism in agriculture. No, this is the only safeguard against carbon leakage. Because whenever we would not be consistent in requesting and demanding the same standards from those outside interest, we would be just producing with higher standards here and allow imports of something that would be much less ecological. As our colleague from Yara has said, today we have problem with fertilizers. Yes, we can import them, but look at their ecological footprint. And this is what will happen. And the most critical here is animal production. And I also agree with the extensification point, okay? The problem is not the production. Problem is the pollution, if I put it simply. So if we can produce more with much less environmental externality, then don't preach about production. We don't need to preach about production. In Europe, we are producing the most ecologic way on the planet. There are few other places where they produce with the same level of ecology as we do in Europe. So let's be smart, and we need to use technology and digital. But also, and I come back to my point, we need to be consistent in policies. We cannot say we want to reduce fertilizers, we want to reduce pesticide, and at the same time not having measures how to accelerate alternatives to having that.
Okay, thank you, Martin. That was a lot in your answer there. You brought up a lot of areas, and some of the areas that I want to start talking about now. I mean, you were quite critical about the EU in terms of maybe being a bit too slow moving when it comes to innovation. So I don't know whether I want to give Michael a chance to respond to that quickly, or do you not? Only if you want to. There's no pressure.
No, I'm very happy. I already went on record earlier that saying innovation is key. If you look at agri-food production systems in general and the huge increases in productivity that have taken place over recent decades, the key factor has not been inputs like fertilizers, it's been innovation. And Europe is very strong in innovation. I think the problem very often is the measure of innovation at European level is our approach towards GM. And yes, there are issues there, and those issues are still with us in terms of new breeding techniques, but they will be addressed. The Commission has undertaken to present proposals early next year. But don't look at our approach towards innovation only from that perspective. We have very ambitious policies on innovation, Horizon Europe, within the agri-food system itself, in our CAP strategic plans, because we recognize that essentially the solutions lie primarily in innovation.
So hopefully that will satisfy Martin. But I want us to move on from the topic of innovation. I also want to say that we have a Q&A on the swap card. So there's 10 minutes left of our panel, so you can ask questions to the panelists, and I will select them from here. They come up on my iPad, so just it's saying there's something going wrong here, but I think it should be fine. Maybe that's because no one's asked a question yet. So yeah, fill in the poll and ask me some questions on this iPad for the panelists if you've got a burning question. But I mean, Martin also brought up this question of protectionism and how it's also linked to the you talked about the EU not needing to be, shouldn't be in a bunker. No one should be opting for sort of full-on self-sufficiency, a bit like what Russia seems to be trying to do with its own food system. But do you see that Europe is leading the way in terms of raising up standards around the world, or do you see that actually this could backfire and the Green Deal could lead to Europe maybe ending up as a bit of a green paradise where we're demanding lots of things of other people, but actually we don't, our standards are much higher in Europe than elsewhere in the world?
So, I mean, many countries want to build this bunker at one point until reality catch up. But even Russia is not in a bunker. They are going to have the record year in wheat export on their side this year, okay?
Well, that's what, according to Vladimir Putin.
No. Factually, and that's a problem, actually, because you see on one hand, Russia say, oh, the sanction doesn't let us export. Factually, they are going to have a record year, okay? So the sanction doesn't block their export. That's why, a lot of narratives said by policymakers cannot be even internally consistent with the change, the story they want to say. But yes, Russia is an agricultural exporter for a long time now, at least since the rebuild after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But on the livestock sector, we have, so Russia has decided to become self-sufficient on the livestock sector after the sanction coming from the Crimea invasion. And Europe was exporting a lot of meat to Russia, and that has stopped. But it had an impact on European farmers, but European farmers have also found other markets, so the system is flexible. Similarly, China, for a long time, didn't want to import meat products. They want to be self-sufficient for meat product, and then they get the African swine fever that has decimated their livestock, and then they started to import as crazy. So that people are very pragmatic, but sometimes it's much better to create a system that is resilient and balance the different aspects from the beginning, just that to be driven by ideology. Now, this question of carbon leakage, so the fact that, the cleaner we are in Europe, and I think that sometimes people don't realize how clean we can be even when we have done intensification. Producing 1 liter of milk in Western Europe emit 20% less CO2 than producing 1 liter of milk in Ethiopia. Okay? So innovation, intensification make a lot of sense, even if sometimes people think, oh, but having a few cows grazing in the middle of nowhere is better for the environment. No. If you want to drink milk, no. And actually, milk is very important for global nutrition. Even if in Europe we may consume too much milk, many parts of the world doesn't consume enough. So one of the questions is who is going to produce this milk and how? But now the question of carbon linkage. that the fact that we are going to import some dirty product. For some sectors, so it was a nice story about milk, but if you look at tomato, because most of the tomato in Europe are grown in greenhouses, and so we use natural gas to heat greenhouses, it's still much better to bring tomato from Morocco, even with transportation. So you know that notion about what is clean, what is dirty, is it something abroad or domestic, has to be at one point based on science and not just on beliefs. And that's where the sensitivity. But just linked to that, there's also this development aspect. Africa has comparative advantage in agriculture. They are good land, good climate, but they don't have the technology. If tomorrow we put a carbon tax at the border of Europe, just for the example I've given you, but that's true for many other cases, a lot of sub-Saharan African countries will not be able to export to Europe because their product is dirty. So or we give it for free from the development, or we invest in this part to catch up of the technology. So I really think that, you know, Europe has to lead by example, but also to help other countries in the world to catch up with this technology, because at the end, we are in one ship. The fact that we emit 1 ton of CO2 in Europe, or 1 ton of CO2 in Malawi, or 1 ton of CO2 in Brazil, that's the same thing. Okay? We will be all impacted by climate change. So that is still where, you know, getting this global approach by sharing technology and having policy that try to bring people together, even of creating conflict, is critical.
But can I just stay with you for a moment? I mean, because one other big warning that people have said is that this the combination of crises, especially the Ukraine war, is going to lead to, you know, a huge sort of domino effect of trade protectionism on agriculture. I mean, there has been some export bans put up. I mean, Hungary has an export export controls, export ban on cereals at the moment. Are you seeing that this is leading to more kind of, you know, protectionist policies this year?
So this year, yes. But we have seen this year similar behavior than in 2007 and 2008, a bit less than in 2011, 2012. But at the beginning of the COVID crisis, we have seen the same thing. At the time also, Romania was trying to put an export restriction on their own grain because they were panicking. So really, it's important, you know, science-based policy to avoid panic reaction. Because during this crisis, we always see panic. I think my other colleague can talk about that. And that's why it's so important to think that it's not the first time that the world has seen a crisis. The crisis of today is actually, in terms of prices, including fertilizer prices, less violent than the 2007-8. And the last 20 years are much better than the 70s. I mean, that, you know, I was not born at that time, but go back to the 70s. See the oil price shock, how it has shocked economy. We had the food price crisis. We had the major fertilizer price crisis. We have geopolitical problems. So, I mean, you know, the world has survived in all of that. And still we are making progress. It's not a smooth road, and we have to be cautious, and we have to be pragmatic and realistic. But thinking that tomorrow the world global system is going to collapse just because there was an invasion of Ukraine, no.
Okay, well, that's an upbeat message, I suppose, in some ways. Michael, when we just mentioned that, you know, that one EU country has put up a cereals export ban, and the Commission has started an infringement procedure against Hungary. What is the latest, you know, development on that front? You're still waiting to hear back from Budapest?
Well, if I recall correctly, they were required to reply to us by the 15th of September, and certainly up to a few days ago, they hadn't replied. But, you know, they'll be held to account. But more generally, Hungary itself has now basically recorded an extremely poor maize harvest and will be in the very unusual and exceptional situation where they will almost certainly need to import. And it's a timely reminder that essentially autarky isn't an option, and that unjustified restrictions on trade are entirely counterproductive. Building on the example earlier from the COVID crisis, at the early stages of the crisis, we had to send a very strong message to member states that essentially the internal market was at risk, not just in trade and agri-food products, but all the essential, let's say, issues like inputs like packaging, et cetera, and that the best way of dealing with it was respecting the internal market legislation and allowing trade to flow and putting trust in our very sound, efficient governance systems, our regulatory systems, our transparency, our accountability, et cetera, and unilateral actions of that nature were entirely self-defeating and unjustified, and that message remains.
Okay. Do you want to come in here, Nicola? Or has anything piqued your interest, or Martin? I mean, well, Nicola go first, and then maybe we'll have Martin.
No. In general, we are supporting this open agri-food markets. But what I wanted to mention maybe is the effect of the supply chain disruptions we have today as well, because any delay in purchasing or deliveries is having a huge impact.
Yeah.
We observe today those difficulties. Fertilizers are applied from Feb to April, May, but we produce all year long, and we don't have really anymore the buffer today due to those logistics issues in Europe in general, and it impacts as well today.
Okay. Martin, what have you heard from our panelists, in terms of trade and sort of trade protectionism have you heard anything that's worrying you?
Well, I think we have to distinguish two elements, and this is a circulation in the internal market and our attitude to external partners. Because with the erosion of multilateralism that I was mentioned, we are adding new elements into the redefinition of the standards of product. Unfortunately, the trade, the international trade rules have not evolved that much since 2004, no? Since Hong Kong, or 5. And in the meantime, we've been adding a lot of externalities into our production patterns, including into our policies like CAP. So we cannot afford to trade with our partners in the fashion that was 20 years old, while we are moving forward and want to get them attracted to put on the path with us towards Green Deal and biodiversity. Well, in fact, emissions and biodiversity ambitions, if we speak about agri-food chain. So on internet market, and again, theory and practice is different. We saw it during the COVID. Yeah, everyone was preaching of a free circulation, while countries you would not bet before have imposed restrictions on face masks, and these were just face masks. These were not food. So could you imagine if we have a crisis, how responsibly would be politicians listening to the commission statements that they should allow free circulation, because in the books it is said that it is better. So what is protection to this? Again, we need to find solution. The protection to this is certain level of autonomy, and I know some people don't like it. And second, what we have been attending for, but we need to continue. Short logistic chains, and this is fully compatible with our climate and environmental objectives. So I think these are elements, again, that we need to unleash. We are talking about short distribution channels for 20 years, I remember, here in Brussels. And what has happened? I think the biggest retailers in Europe are still running their logistics centers according to their cost base, not according to the pollution they are making with transporting food from one side of Europe to another. So
okay,
this
Martin,
is what I
thank you.
This is coherence of our policies.
Thank you, Martin. And one more quick word. We're over time, but Nicola wants to come in just at the end.
Just because we are running out of time, indeed, CBAM is a very good example, because we expect fair rules on that one. So mirror clauses are extremely important. We have a very clean industry in France, in Europe. It needs to be taken into account.
Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists. We had a really, wide-ranging discussion, putting the Ukraine war into context. in terms of the agricultural, world markets, talking about the threat of autarky, the stupidity of bunker mentalities, and of course, looking earlier on at how the energy crisis, is going to affect fertilizers, how it's going to affect potentially food production in Europe, and what the EU is doing to respond to that. So, yeah, I just want to say thank you so much to our 4 fantastic panelists. Great. Just one before you leave. I think that's something I have to say, but I've now lost it in my notes. But we'll be back shortly with a panel on the Common Agricultural Policy. So we'll have about 2-3 minutes before then. Great. Thanks. Cheers.